Today, part one of a two-part video series on how I autofocus Nikon Z cameras. Today we're going to talk about the Z5, Z6, Z7, Z30, Z50, ZFC, the earlier Nikon bodies. Next week we'll talk about the Z9 and Z8. Tips, tricks, and settings. Well, hey everyone, it's Hudson. And today we're going to start part one of a two-part video series on particularly action autofocus for the Nikon mirrorless system. I know a lot of people of late have been moving to mirrorless. I've been having tons of requests, both, how do I autofocus my Z50? How do I autofocus my Z6? How do I autofocus my Z8, Z9? How does that hybrid autofocus for action system that you describe in your setup videos work? And I have done setup videos for all of those cameras and more Nikons, and I'm going to put links to those detailed setup videos where I discuss how to set up custom function buttons to do the things I'm about to talk about in this video. But I really think of the Nikon mirrorless autofocus system being developed in two phases. And the first is all the cameras that came before the Z9. And then the Z9 has a couple of features that make it a little bit more powerful for tracking action, sports, wildlife, those kinds of things. And we set it up a little bit differently as a consequence. Now, I think the original cameras got a really bad rap when they didn't necessarily deserve to. And I've been using this Z6 as my secondary camera, and even in certain cases, like when I went to Cuba, my primary camera, for years now. It's a fantastic camera, and I think ever since Nikon got to autofocus version firmware 3.0 for the original Z6 and Z7, Z5 cameras in the Z6ii, Z7ii cameras came with that built in, the autofocus got really, really good. It's pretty darn impressive, particularly, using some of its more advanced on the sensor auto detection modes. And there's a way to set up overriding it, and straight out of the box, it's complicated and not intuitive and difficult to manage the controls for the subject tracking override. I've got a simple way in my setup to map one of your function buttons to make that task really easy for those earlier cameras. And it's the same, whether you're using the ZFC, the Z50, the Z30 even, the Z5, Z6, Z7, all the variants before the Z8 and Z9. And I'm going to save next week for the Z8 and Z9. Now let me differentiate. We're really talking about action, sports, wildlife, the tricky things to autofocus on. When I'm running around just, on a trail, hiking, or in the town, or just, point and shoot, having fun with my camera, I tend to use single servo. I'm not in autofocus continuous. I tend to use single point autofocus. If I suddenly find myself in a wildlife or action shooting scenario, I'll jump into my user 3 setting on the mode dial here, and boom, that activates all of my action settings. And that's what we're going to talk about here on Sauvie Island. I'm going to showcase exactly how I work in action scenarios and let you look through the viewfinder while I do it. All right, so let's say, I'm hiking along the beach with my Z6ii, and I'm in my just kind of normal mode. I'm in single point AFS. You can see that right here if I go into the I menu. I'm in single point, moves around the frame fast, AFS, locks focus. I'm in manual mode, 400th of a second, F11. I'm sort of surveying what's going on out here. This is the Z6ii again. Suddenly I realize, my friends are getting their kites out. They're getting ready to ride. Jason's an amazing rider. Well, I'm gonna reach up, flip into my user 3 mode. Again, that's in my Z6ii, Z7ii setup video. And that's linked in this video's description. But now all of a sudden, you'll notice that I'm in auto area autofocus. That's those wide brackets. I hit my I menu. You can see I happen to have auto area autofocus with people. I could choose wildlife if it were wildlife. But this is just straight up auto area. The camera's gonna determine the subject and find it. Now I've mapped subject tracking override to the function 2 button. We'll talk about that in a second. The other thing I have to do is change my drive mode. I was in single frame. I want to go into high speed. I really wish you could map that to a user mode, but you can't. Now the minute I press and hold the autofocus on button, it's going to find my subject automatically, particularly if they're moving and I'm tracking them. The camera's amazing at that. All right? Just amazing. Now, sometimes when you have more than one subject, another mode I sometimes use, I'll go in here to my I menu, is wide area, and I like wide area large usually, and that's gonna give me a box. and it'll ignore what's not in that box. It's only looking for subjects in the box. So I could say, you know, Brian's what I want, not the other kiter that was out there. All right, only gonna focus on things within that red box, but I don't get subject tracking override. We're about to talk about that subject tracking override in just a second, all right? Now, when sometimes you have a subject that's just too far away or you don't have a long enough lens, that's where subject tracking override comes in. That's where we're gonna go back with the Z6ii, Z7ii, Z50s of the world. We're gonna go into that auto area. And you know, the way the camera company has it set up, you're supposed to hit the OK button to activate subject tracking and the minus button, the reduced magnification to turn it off. That's really complicated with your thumb while you're tracking action and shooting and changing stuff. Whoa, there's a big barge. You know, instead, I like to map it to the function 2 button. And then I can say, whoa, I want to lock that barge. And wherever I go in the frame, that barge is what's important to me. I've just said that's my subject, all right? Ooh, it lost it. If it loses it, let go. It's ready to reacquire. I'm holding the AF on button down. As long as I hold it down, it's on that subject I selected and it tracks it all over the frame. Let off, all right? Now, when all of a sudden I have a subject back in my frame that's big enough, I'm gonna turn that off. I could track him with subject tracking override, but auto area autofocus, the minute I hit that button, it's gonna find the person, especially a person that I'm following, and I can nail it. You can see that blackout that happens with the Z6ii, Z7ii. You know, what I do for that is just go a little wider. I can always crop a bit. And that way, you know, you can sort of just anticipate what's happening. It's a little harder with birds in flight than with these kiters. It's a little harder yet with kiters that are moving really fast, doing stuff right in front of you, which I'll show you in just a second. I'll show you how good auto area autofocus is when you've got a subject close in the frame. You know, it's these distant subjects. You know, that's not going to be an award-winning photo anyway. If I hit focus, it doesn't do a terrible job. It basically picks infinity, which is where they're at, right? That's where maybe you pick subject tracking and you choose what you're locking and it follows it around, all right? But when you got somebody that's close and frame filling, that's where things get great. I'll track Jason as he takes off here. You know, all I have to do is hold the AF on button. AF on off, nothing's happening. It's not tracking anything. It's while I hold that AF on button down with back button focus, all of a sudden, it recognizes what my subject is. When he comes back around, he's an amazing kiter, Jason. I'll show you how well it tracks through cool action. All right, so as Jason's coming at me, he's small in the frame. I could choose subject tracking just to lock him instead of the lines. But as he comes closer, I want to turn that off. The same function 2 button I program turns that off, and now it's locking him. And since we have human detection, it's gonna even pick him up. Whoa, there we go. Awesome. It picks up the human. It's looking for humans. If I flip to animal, it would be looking with the Z6ii and Z7ii, mainly for cats and dogs. But I find it does other animals too. I've had it track deer. I've had it track some egrets that were close up. You know, it's looking for eyes of animals. This is looking for eyes of people. And again, you get to that through that AF area mode in your eye menu. That's where I like to keep that. That way you can just hit that button and choose. Am I using after animals? Am I after people? All right, that's the key for the Z6ii, Z7ii. And again, you know, if they're close and frame filling, it's gonna pick them up even if they're not moving much. If it doesn't, we hit the function 2 button, we say that's my subject, it tracks it. They start moving, I turn that back off with the function 2 button and just hold down the AF on button and boom, got him. That's simple. You can see right there, I was focused on the other kiter and then Jason came by in the foreground, and just by letting off the AF on button and pressing it again, it went for this closer, larger subject that I'm suddenly tracking with. It just picks it up that quick. I want to come back, I let off, grab. It sees him out there. It's pretty amazing, you know? Here's my friend Parmeed walking up the beach. Boom. You don't have to pick your subject. The sensor knows a human. And the sensor knows what's moving and what's the thing that you're after in the frame. It's pretty darn incredible the way the sensor-based autofocus picks these things up. Let me just dispel, if you were a DSLR shooter and you're used to dynamic area autofocus and that's what you're shooting with the Z cameras, you're kind of missing what's special about this modern technology with mirrorless. The sensor has the ability to identify a subject and track it automatically, and it does an amazing job of that. You rarely need to override it. And you can take advantage of that with your Z6, Z7, all those other cameras, Z50. But you just have to get out of dynamic area. If that's something you've been using for years like I did in the DSLR area, I almost never took it out. Occasionally I would use group area autofocus, but I was almost always in dynamic area, and I haven't used it since a month after I got my original Nikon Z7 when they first launched. It's just a legacy mode to me. I use auto area autofocus, and I identify what type of subject I'm looking for, and if needed, I use subject tracking override. But you'd be surprised, if you have the right lens for your action that you're shooting, how infrequently you actually need that. Well, okay, I hope that dispels a few myths about the older Nikon mirrorless cameras, the Z6, Z7, 2 variants, the APS-C versions that are based on the Z50 sensor, not tracking action well. They track action quite well, and there's a few ways to use them where you can get just as amazing results as you can out of the Z8 and the Z9. It's maybe not quite as simple, and we'll talk about that next week. Remember, next week, Z8, Z9. If you don't have one or you're curious, you'll see what the difference is when I go through how I set those up differently next week. It really all revolves around having 3D autofocus tracking, a new version of that, not what we had in the DSLRs, but we'll talk about that next week. Now, just, I hope I see all of you. I'm heading off for a workshop in Newport this week. Totally excited about it. Central Oregon coast, beautiful landscapes. And I won't be back until after the second video goes live. But we'll do an office hours shortly after we're back from that workshop with Tales from the Road, taking your Q&A questions. So you can sign up for that big free group photography get together, either on Zoom or YouTube Live. You can also just go into this video's description, and there's a chaptered out table of contents about everything that we've talked about here in this video. Links to all the photographic equipment that I use and advocate you think about using, and those links help me out, so I appreciate your using them in advance. You can sign up for those office hours and leave us a question when you sign up. Choose your platform, Zoom or YouTube Live. And again, that's going to be on Tuesday, September 5th. So I hope to see you there. And until then, you know, I'll be looking at you next week, and between then and now, talking about autofocus tips and techniques with the Z8 and the Z9. So look for that. That's coming next week. All right, everybody. I hope you're staying safe, staying creative, and I'm going to get out, photograph, and do a little kite foiling.